Hello, Strange Thinkers. I'm the philosopher Zach Gitrich. I run the blog strangecornersofthought.com along with this YouTube channel. It's the holidays, and I wanted to show you one of my bookshelves to give you an idea of the type of books that I use in my work. I have 4.5 bookshelves in total. The bookshelf I'm going to show you is one of my nonfiction bookshelves. It was originally alphabetized by author, but time makes fools of us all. Okay, so as I said, my library is in alphabetical order, or at least it was at one point. And as you might be able to see, all of my bookshelves are double booked. Every single one. That's how many books I have. I'll probably mainly focus on the ones in the front row, just because it will be easier. And yes, I have a lot of books, and no, I probably have not actually read most of these. It turns out that the hobby of buying books and reading books are two completely separate hobbies. So I'm also going to try and focus mainly on books that I actually have read. So right here we have Simone de Beauvoir. This is like her magnum opus, The Second Sex. This is where she famously states that one is not born but becomes a woman. And basically what she's describing is gender, even though she doesn't explicitly call it that. You also have Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter. She actually wrote 5 total memoirs going throughout her entire life. Here's The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is a really easy way to get into Simone de Beauvoir, and goes into basically existentialism, especially existentialist ethics. The Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. This is an excellent book for understanding anti-fascist movements in basically the past 100 years, and what they actually consist of, how it is that they justify the use of violence against who they perceive as fascist forces. Even if you don't agree with Antifa, this is definitely an excellent read. Here I have a couple different translations of a book by the Jewish existentialist philosopher Martin Buber called I and Thou. And he is generally considered an existentialist. I don't think he ever actually publicly said that, but a lot of people, when they think of existentialism, they mainly think of the atheists, because they were definitely the more popular ones, so like Nietzsche, the French existentialists like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. But, you know, starting with Kierkegaard, there is a tradition of religious existentialism. And even if you're an atheist, understanding those arguments are definitely valuable. Okay, so here we have 2 different works. We have the Bhagavad Gita, which is probably the most popular part of the Mahabharata, which is an Indian epic. It is literally, and across the world, the Mahabharata is the longest literary work ever invented, but the Bhagavad Gita is kind of the most famous part of that, and it focuses on the philosophy of Hinduism, especially involving Krishna, who is an avatar of Lord Vishnu. And then you have the Dhammapada, which is basically the philosophical teachings of the Buddha. And these are some of his original teachings that you'll find. They're not like later teachings by other Buddhists down the line. These are some of the original ones that he actually thought. And this translation by Eknath Iswaran is absolutely amazing. Okay, so here we have some Camus, Myth of Sisyphus, a lot of essays that he did on called Resistance, Rebellion, and Death. Here are some more lyrical and critical essays. And this is a book that he wrote called The Rebel, an Essay on Man in Revolt. This right here, The History of Philosophy by Frederick Copleston. He was a Jesuit priest and philosophy professor that wrote these like really in-depth basically anthologies of Western philosophy. So if you're familiar with like Bertrand Russell's The History of Philosophy, think of that, but like 1,000 times more complete. So these are, if you're in undergraduate philosophy course, or especially if you're in graduate philosophy courses, these are musts. I think this is the only one that I have, volumes 1 through 3, which basically covers ancient Greece through the medieval period. So here's a great book called They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration. It is by philosopher Aviva Chomsky. That is Noam Chomsky's daughter, and it goes over the most basic myths surrounding immigration that really fuels kind of like xenophobic thought and anti-immigrant sentiment. Alright, so we are down to the second shelf. This is where Lord Ganesha hangs out, at least somewhere on this bookshelf. And you've probably seen this in the background. This is like a light-up thing of Lord Shiva doing the Dance of Destruction. There's a lot of Foucault here, and I've talked about some of my Foucault books in the past. So I'm going to try and focus on the books, some of the books in the back row, specifically two thinkers. So the first one are a series of books written by Daniel Dennett. If you were ever part of the new atheist movement that was really popular in the 2000s, you might remember Daniel Dennett being considered one of the four horsemen of atheism. I don't actually know how involved in that movement he was. He is an atheist. He's written books about atheism. But he is a, trained, tenured philosophy professor that had a career long before the new atheist movement kind of popped up, especially in the wake of 9/11 and the Bush presidency. And he's written not just on atheism, he's written on the problem of freedom. Here's Elbow Room, The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting, which I remember writing one of my first philosophy papers using this book. He also writes extensively about philosophy of mind. That's another big research area. And then he writes philosophy of science, looking at Darwinianism. And then obviously he does have several books on philosophy of religion from an atheist perspective. So if you were ever into the new atheist movement and you remember hearing about Dennett, while he does study that, and he is more of a trained philosopher than some of those other members were, I think the four were, it was Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and then Richard Dawkins. Those were basically the four horsemen, or at least how they were advertised. But yeah, Dennett has a ton of work completely independent of all that. Alright, so this is a book called Slavery's Exile, The Story of the American Maroons, by Sylvian A. Diouf, at least I think I'm saying that right. This basically talks about people who escaped slavery not by escaping down to Mexico, which was at the time they had abolished slavery a long time ago, or by going north and escaping to Canada, which also abolished slavery, but people who they escaped from slavery and they basically started these very small communities with other freed slaves. Most of the times they were in very difficult terrain, stuff that couldn't be farmed, that was just in general very difficult to get to, and they completely lived off the land. And some of these communities were actually fairly significant in size. They typically didn't last for very long because there was a concerted state effort to try and recapture these people. But this is just absolutely a fascinating work. So here we have the basic writings of Freud, and this contains a lot of his most important works that he did. So the psychopathology of everyday life, the interpretations of dreams, the three contributions on the theory of sex, wit and its relation to the unconscious, totem and taboo, the history of the psychoanalytic movement. So if you do want a basic understanding of some of Freud's early writings, it's definitely good to have. I also have The Ego and the Id, which along with Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which I actually have an online copy, I think, are other really important works if you're trying to understand Freud or psychoanalysis or kind of some of the crazy shit they talk about. I'm not a huge fan of psychoanalysis, but it's had such an important historical impact that, it's kind of like me as an atheist reading the Bible. You need to read it so that you can at least know how to refute it, basically. So this is Harvest of Empire by Juan Gonzalez. He's actually a contributor on Democracy Now!, so you might have seen him there. This got made into a documentary. It's a history of Latinos in America, but it really goes in depth. One, Latinos in America come from, a variety of different nationalities, but it's called Harvest of Empire because the American Empire has spent decades upon decades upon decades being involved in the politics of Central and Southern America, especially supporting dictatorships and just really, really brutal regimes. And it tries to give you an idea of when we see immigration from these countries, it's directly because of our clandestine activities down in essentially Latin America. We also have Undoing Gender by Judith Butler. This is a follow-up to her classic Gender Trouble, but this is actually a much more accessible read. Some of her stuff is very, very difficult and very, very technical. This is written more for a layperson, so if you just kind of want to get an idea of what Judith Butler is like, I would definitely check out Undoing Gender. This is another great book called You've Changed, Sex Reassignment and Personal Identity, and it basically focuses on how trans people construct their identities. It has several pieces actually written by trans philosophers. Definitely a book that I have relied on heavily to kind of give conceptions to some of these ideas. In case you're wondering, this is some type of ancient Chinese statue. I don't know what any of this means, but this is an elephant and this is a dragon. This was given to me by my uncle many, many, many years ago. So if he's wondering if I still have it, I still got it, don't worry. Okay, so there's a couple of really cool books to check out. We have Frantz Fanon, both Black Skin, White Mask, which is his earliest writing, and that gives you a kind of black existentialism, black psychology, and then you have Wretched of the Earth, which is his last thing that he wrote, which is just freaking brilliant as far as understanding the way that colonialism has impacted Africa, the types of resistances, also giving philosophical justification for different types of the ways that Africans have resisted colonial rule. It also gives a lot of good philosophical critiques, especially of African and African-American political philosophy. It really puts to test some of the different theories that had come up around what it meant to be an African, what it meant to have lived under colonial rule, or if you're African American, what it meant to be having originally come from the African continent, but also how in America, and I am kind of talking about the Americas in general, even though I live in the United States, because of slavery, many African Americans do not know their heritage prior to slavery. And so that's why in a lot of ways we say that slavery literally erased the history for the black enslaved people that were brought over here. But Frantz Fanon is from Algeria. He studied in France, so he's part of the whole Francophone literary tradition, and this is definitely going to focus more on Africa and colonialism than it is African American thought in general. I will link to all these books in the description below. They all have Amazon links that you can go to and check out on your own, and if you do choose to buy them through Amazon, it actually does help the channel out a lot. However, I also have digital copies of many of these books, as well as a number of books that I don't have physical copies of. Here's an example of some of the books I have uploaded. If you don't want to give all your money to Amazon, I offer a special deal where you can access and download all of these books straight off of my Strange Folder of Thought. In order to get access to this folder, you need to sign up to my Patreon account. The $5 tier gives you access to the Strange Folder of Thought. And it's just an open Google folder, so once you have the link, by purchasing the $5 tier, you can cancel your membership afterwards so you don't get charged again the next month, though obviously I'd love to have you all as long-term Patreon supporters. The other benefit of purchasing access to the Strange Folders of Thought is all of the various articles that I've amassed over time that are often hidden behind paywall goblins. Lots of cool stuff in there, check it out. Back to the book tour. We also have Revolution at Zero Point, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle by Silvia Federici. Now, if you have actually been watching the channel, you'll know that Silvia Federici wrote the book Caliban and the Witch, which we have been doing a deep analysis of for basically the past year. But that book is primarily a kind of history book, or at least studying the philosophical thought throughout history that led to some of the current conditions. This is the book that talks more about stuff in the last 50 years. Silvia Federici famously helped start the Wages for Housework movement, which relates, again, back to Caliban and the Witch. And Silvia Federici's contention has always been that capitalism, throughout the entirety of capitalism, it could not exist without the unpaid labor of reproductive work primarily and almost exclusively done by women. So the actual work of reproducing the species, of giving birth, of educating children, all of that stuff is labor, and today it is considered kind of like an axiom that this should be unpaid labor. You shouldn't get paid to do this. But, as I said, Federici contends that capitalism would not have developed, nor would it be able to sustain itself unless it relied on the unpaid labor of women. And this is a series, this is mainly her philosophical essays and stuff like that, but this is, if you don't want to read all of Caliban and the Witch, or if you want to get, it's not even that long, really, if you think about it, so, and it's not difficult to read through, it's really easy for any layperson just to kind of pick it up, and get a good understanding of what she's trying to get at there. Alright, so this is a book by David Harvey, who is a very famous Marxist professor, who currently teaching. He's done some really amazing work, and this is called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. So, if you're unfamiliar with what neoliberalism is, which is more common in the States than it is, say, in Europe, neoliberalism is the form of capitalism that we have today. So you might go back to the 18th and the 19th century and we would have what you might call classical capitalism. And then, in a response to the socialism and communism that developed, especially through Marx, you have more of a modern capitalism, which is very Keynesian. If you're familiar with the United States, like we're talking about FDR, big deal type policies, things that ultimately, they offer certain trade-offs to workers, right? We're going to give you some union protection, we're going to give you Social Security, you have the right to get health insurance through your company, so we're going to give you some trade-offs so that you don't actually see some means of production. But after modern liberalism is where we get neoliberalism. And again, this is a brief work, it's not very long, but it will give you a really good understanding of what neoliberalism is, and the figures that were absolutely instrumental in making this happen, especially in the 80s. You have Ronald Reagan, you have Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, but you also have Deng Xiaoping in what is considered communist China, and Harvey does a good job at explaining how Deng Xiaoping is part of neoliberalism, and it's a really accessible work. It's really easy to understand. Okay, so this is Martin Eslin's famous Theater of the Absurd. I actually, before I decided to start studying philosophy, I studied theater. I was convinced that I was going to be, a really successful actor and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, that didn't work. But my favorite type of theater is Theater of the Absurd, and if you're familiar with Camus, right, this notion of absurdism. Obviously, absurdism is very closely linked to existentialism, especially atheist existentialism, but Theater of the Absurd, it's very avant-garde, it's very out there, it's very interesting, it's strange. If you are a strange thinker, this actually does a really good job of explaining Theater of the Absurd, a lot of the themes, and giving you ideas of what plays that you should read. And because I did theater for such a long time, basically the entire time I was a lad, I was involved in theater, and I was that was going to be my future. I have a ton of these types of plays. So this is an excellent book to get if you want to learn about Theater of the Absurd, or you want to learn more about absurdism, or more about existentialism in general, and see how those ideas work out aesthetically. So here we have the outlines of Pyrrhonism by Sextus Empiricus. So Pyrrho was an ancient Greek philosopher, and is probably one of the earliest thinkers of what we would today call, skepticism, a kind of extreme skepticism. Today, probably the most famous skeptic is philosopher David Hume, who lived during the 18th century. But if you want to see some of the origins of skepticism, if you're into skepticism at all, this is where you would find it. And again, it's the outlines of Pyrrhonism, because a lot of his works, I don't think any of his works exist anymore. So this is Sextus Empiricus, who was someone that lived later, that maybe did have actual access to the texts before they were all lost. And this is basically how we know about Pyrrhonism. So as you can maybe see back here, I have a ton of books by German philosopher Martin Heidegger. I'm such a huge Heidegger fan. Yes, I know he was a Nazi. Yes, I would have punched him for being a Nazi if I'd ever met him, but his metaphysics and ontology and just his philosophy in general is just brilliant, and thankfully he didn't publish any of his scum Nazi beliefs. But I mean, I could do multiple videos just going over every single one of these books. I'm a really big Heidegger fan. Down here we have God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. So if you're into that, that's more simplistic. Obviously we have David Hume. We have some of the earlier works by Husserl, who is the father of phenomenology. Here's another book, Myths and Gender, Biological Theories About Women and Men by Anne Fausto Sterling. This originally came out in, I think, like 1987, so it is very old, but it does a really good job of explaining why something like gender and sex are ultimately different. Like, gender is not merely the social representation of your biological sex. And she goes into detail, specifically looking at the science over the previous 100 years that tried to prove that, for example, women were inherently not as intelligent as men, more passionate, hysterical, weaker, etc., etc. So for a long time, the science that was coming out was explicitly trying to figure out ways to prove that women were inherently these things. And as we know now, women can do all sorts of things. But this is definitely a good textbook that goes into the history of how science has kind of reaffirmed these really false ideas about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, gender expressions in general. Though it does not, again, it's from the 80s, I can't remember, it did not talk a whole lot about trans people at all. It did talk about intersex people. That was something that Anne Fausto Sterling focused a lot on in her works, were intersex people. We also have the Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge by Jean-François Lyotard. This is, again, a very short work, but it does give you a good idea of kind of what postmodernism is, while also talking. So you have postmodernism as a type of philosophy, and then you have postmodernity as a type of era, and that's essentially the era that we live in now, is the era of postmodernity, as opposed to, like, you'd say pre-World Wars, where you could still say we're living in modernity. It's like an epoch or a period of time that we live in. And then we have another book by David Harvey called The 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism. And in this he goes over, the reason he calls these contradictions is because of dialectic philosophy, the idea that you might have two opposing types of things that contradict each other, and in the workings out of that contradiction, you end up getting the result. And he goes over how capitalism creates these different types of contradictions, and they're relatively short chapters, really easy to understand. It's a great book if you kind of want to get a good understanding of how capitalism works without like reading 1,000 pages of Marx or something like that. So David Harvey is always a good person to check out. So this is an anthology, Philosophy of Religion. It was edited by Louis Poyman and Michael Ray. Whenever I do a video that deals with philosophy of religion, I'm probably in some way referencing this text. Some of the works in there are very, very complicated, very difficult, very dense. But if you really want to understand problems like proofs of God, you know, whether you're talking about the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, you know, epistemic knowledge of the divine, i.e. belief, the problem of evil, and innumerable other things that come up whenever you discuss philosophy of religion. It's just such a excellent work. It has classic works in it, like Leibniz and Hume, and St. Aquinas and Kant, but it also has more recent works. But again, some of these works in here are relatively easy to understand. Some of them, like anything by fucking Plantinga, they're beyond, like, my ken. Like, I don't know. I don't always understand his arguments, because they're they're just very complex. It can be hard to follow along. But this is, I would say this is a must-have if you have any interest in philosophy of religion. Subscribe to my channel on YouTube or directly to my blog at strangecornersofthought.com and become a patron on Patreon so that you can see more strange philosophy videos. I'll see you the next time you make a wrong turn in one of my Strange Corners of Thought. Bye! Special thanks to you, Srepet, for supporting the channel on Patreon!